Hello, my name is Callista, and for SIS 306, my research project is titled Fleeing the Northern Triangle of Central America, the Intersection of Power, Politics, and Gender and Migration to the U.S. Now we can dive into the research puzzle. My region of focus for this research project is the Northern Triangle of Central America, because I will be looking at female migrants who migrate from this region of the world to the U.S. and how they are represented in U.S. government literature. The context of gender-based violence in the Northern Triangle is necessary to understand why so many women flee this region. The three countries in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, have some of the highest femicide rates in the world, and the scholarly literature highlights machismo, i.e., which is basically a norm of male domination, as a contributing factor to structural violence that women suffer in this region. However, it is important to note that women don't necessarily escape the cycle of violence by simply migrating north. In fact, they're often at elevated risk for kidnapping, human trafficking, and sexual assault on the migration trail. And even when they arrive to the U.S. border, depending on the immigration policies of the presidential administration, they may be forced to wait in Mexico while their asylum claims are being heard. For this project, as I have stated, my object of inquiry is migrant women from the Northern Triangle. I analyze this object of inquiry through an official layer of discourse, through congressional hearings, judicial cases, letters and statements from nonprofit leaders, and statements from policy experts. And my research question has to do with how it is possible that migrant women have come to be viewed as both threats and assets to the United States. In a more elaborated form, I proposed to analyze official discourses from politicians, policy analysts, judges, and leaders of civil advocacy organizations about these female migrants from the Northern Triangle of Central America in the United States from the turn of the century to the present day. And I sought to find out how female migrants have been represented specifically in these two opposing ways, either as victims in need of state protection or as women with virtues that benefit the U.S., while simultaneously being grouped into a category of foreigners, represented as a threat to the laws, institutions, and systems of the U.S. So in order to conduct this research in a thorough and reasonable way, I had to make some very intentional decisions about my methodology. The first decision that I made was to select an elastic strategy of analysis, which, according to Dunn and Neumann, is appropriate for researchers interested in tracing the progression or the changes and transformations of a discourse over time. Because I was interested in analyzing how female migrants are represented in U.S. government documents, like congressional hearings and judicial cases, for example, I wanted to see how these representations have either changed, transformed, or progressed over time. And so I found this strategy to be appropriate for my interest. I established the time period as between 1999 and the present day. I needed a focused time period, and originally I had established the beginning of my time period as 1980, but I realized, according to the advice of Dunn and Neumann, that this was not going to be reasonable for the time and effort constraint. I've situated my current time period around 4 moments of immigration policy. The first is the passage of the Battered Immigrant Women Protection Act of 1999, an unprecedented piece of legislation that carved a pathway for female immigrants who were victims of abuse to earn immigration benefits. The second event is the 2014 exodus of families and unaccompanied children from the Northern Triangle to the United States. The third event is the appointment of a special envoy for the Northern Triangle in 2022, which happened under the Biden administration. And the last moment of immigration policy would be the Trump administration, which is a major change, as we can see. Now, the cases for my research, I selected 4 cases, and the reason I selected these cases was because I was interested in looking at how political power is imbued in each of these different figures of authority. And then how that then relates to how they represent female migrants in the literature that I was reading. So my cases are congressional politicians, judges, mostly immigration judges, nonprofit or civil advocacy leaders, as well as policy experts. The representations that I mapped initially had both positive, neutral, and negative connotations. The most prominent representation that I mapped early on that I quickly established a code for was the victim. So women represented as victims in need of state protection. Another example is family caretakers, assets to the United States economically. Some examples of negative connotations of representations that I mapped are violators of the law, asylum fraudsters, burdens on US systems. And so there was a wide mapping of representations early on. And for my in vivo analysis, I wanted to specifically look at the overlap. For example, for a matrix coding query, I wanted to look at the overlap between positive and negative connotations in the codes. So I would put all of my cases in the rows column, for example, and the selected codes in the columns. And so I would put different types of codes, maybe 2 positive codes and 2 negative codes, for example. I use strategies like double reading, which is a cursory reading of a document, and then I went back and carefully coded, and subject positioning, which is the idea that I specifically focus on how migrant women are represented in relation to other groups of people. So the first significant finding from my research was that the dominant discourse for female migrants was actually the representation of them as victims. So as you can see on the comparison diagram to the right of the slide, both of these cases in this example, so leaders of nonprofits and policy experts, both of them share the codes of victims who need state protection or support, as well as each of the child codes for that general victims code. They would be victims of state violence, victims of non-state crime, etc. That was an interesting finding. The second finding that's very important is the finding of that power relations are forming in this context through ideological differences. So not in this diagram, but in the other comparison of the cases, I was able to see that Democratic and Republican ideas of migrants are very different. So Democratic Congress people would focus more on the humanitarian perspective, that these people are victims, that they need state protection, that they bring value to our country, that we need to take care of them. Versus the Republican point of view is more based on security. So they want to look at how these people might be a threat to security, how they might be breaking laws by entering illegally, for example. So these are some very interesting differences that form along political party lines. The next finding that I have is that there is definitely here an oversimplification of identity. And what I mean by that is the representations are just, some of them are very basic in the sense that they don't allow for a lot of nuance. So the idea that someone's entirely a helpless victim or entirely a security threat is kind of, I notice, to be this oversimplification of or emergence of these so-called tropes about these migrant women that are on polar opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. And I have as well the idea of, I have noted the idea of othering. So the idea that these groups of women are kind of othered or kind of viewed as separate or viewed as different than other groups of migrants, whether that's because they're victims or because they require, or because of their claims for asylum, for example. So that was an interesting finding as well. And the last finding is that if you notice from the comparison diagram, all of the actors use both negative and positive representations, but obviously to varying degrees. But you can see both, you have on both sides, policy experts and nonprofit leaders using both negative and positive representations in terms of the connotations. Some of the major implications for this research are that given the discourses about female migrants and the evolution of them over time, we can understand why certain public policy stances were taken versus why others were not. For example, we may be able to better understand why a Republican who views migrants as a security threat might not sponsor a bill for wider asylum benefits. Additionally, the contrasting discourses of migrant women as both assets and threats to the U.S. is made possible by ideological differences and an oversimplification of migrant identities by all actors. All in all, this research encourages us to humanize migrants and view the situations they face with nuance and from different perspectives.